right, Maureen, you ready to do this?
Sure.
All right. Here we go. So 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. All right, folks, welcome back to the Trauma Therapist Podcast. I am very excited to have as my guest today, Maureen McEvoy. Maureen, welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Thanks. So Maureen has been working in the field of trauma for 30 years. She works with individuals, couples, and groups, and is a long-standing instructor with the Justice Institute of British Columbia, teaching other counselors skills for working with survivors of child sexual abuse and other traumas. Maureen provides clinical consultations to a number of counselors and agencies. She's written several articles, including one co-authored with Maggie Ziegler on countertransference and trauma groups. She's recently updated the 3rd edition of Balancing Conflicting Interests, a counselor's guide to the legal process. Maureen is a certified Imago Relationship therapist and clinical consultant. She also presents, along with a business partner, the Getting the Love You Want weekend workshop for couples. All right, Maureen. So, like I said, you've been doing this for a while. First off, thanks for joining me on the podcast today. Before we dive in here, share with the listeners where you're from originally and where you are currently calling from, and we'll dive in.
Currently, I am in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada.
Okay.
And my sort of story around trauma work begins actually at a time when I was in Ontario. And I was still working as a journalist, but I was doing volunteer work for Rape Crisis Center. That's how long ago it was. That's what we called them then. And as a volunteer, I would hear the callers, and I would hear that sometimes callers sort of changed. Their voice changed, their intonation changed, sometimes even their accent changed. And I got very curious about that. And that was the beginning of me beginning to understand there's something very unique about trauma, that's dissociation.
Wow. Well, okay, hold on. So, if I may, so at that time, you were not a therapist.
No.
You were, a volunteer.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes.
Okay.
So then what I did is I changed course correction. I ended up going back to school, getting my degree in counseling, and starting up that work. And so I've been in private practice for, 30 years or something like that.
Wow.
And primarily everybody that I work with has a trauma history. It could be either historical, like child abuse, or it could be very recent, because the Justice Institute, of which I'm a faculty member, also trains the paramedics and the sheriffs and the municipal police officers. Mm-hmm. When they have a critical incident, then I often work with them around that as well. So it was trauma, which on the one hand is fantastic. It's my passion. I've devoted endless hours to refining my skills around it, and I get great satisfaction from it. And it also, vicarious traumatization is a real and true thing, and I absolutely went through a process around that, and we could certainly talk a bit more about that.
Okay, let me pause. Let me interject here, Maureen. So I want to go back. So you were volunteering.
Yep.
You were hearing something with a lot of these callers.
Yep.
What was it within that made you or compelled you to say, you know what, I want to become a therapist?
Journalism and therapy have one thing in common, which is about listening to people tell their story. And so I think there was a way I was a bit primed to be doing this in a certain kind of way. But it was the sense of curiosity. Like, this is so interesting. What is this that I am hearing? It's a different kind of phenomenon. And back in, the mid 80s, we were just beginning to understand this, just beginning to have a way to even name this process of dissociation. So I think it was my curiosity. I am, intrinsically very curious about people and what their story is.
Well, of course, it's one thing to be curious and pursue an education. It's another thing to do the work and to sit with that. What was your experience, your initial experience doing that, sitting with these people who have been traumatized?
Well, it was both the best and the worst, in the sense of when I first started, all we really had as tools were like hypnosis, art therapy, we did have CBT, but from an early place, I just didn't resonate with CBT. So that was not going to be my avenue to do the work. And so I was trying to, little did I know I was ahead of my time in terms of figuring out a bottom-up approaches, right? I've since gone on to do the somatic experiencing work and the EMDR and sensorimotor training. So fairly versed in that. But at the beginning, it was, how do we help people to have a better life? And when their life is being hijacked so much. And so it was really scrabbling around to try to find some way to frame up the resources that maybe they could use to try to experiment to do something a bit different with. And that was very hit and miss, because we were all very hit and miss. And as a field, we made some errors back in those days in terms of looking for trauma memories as opposed to focusing on safety and stabilization.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a great relief when EMDR, for example, came around, because now we had some very specific tools to use that also included positive resource installations. That was a life changer.
Mm-hmm. So you go back to school, you pursue becoming a therapist. What happens next? Where did you start working?
I started working in private practice. I've always been in private practice.
Okay.
While I was still going to school, as my capacity as a volunteer, I was doing groups with women who had been sexually abused as children, and creating a way for those women to receive validation and connection. That morphed over the years, guys, so that I have done some very, very interesting groups. I have done groups for people who were sexually assaulted by mental health professionals, the absolute opposite of what we would want to have. I have done groups with people who have had very severe dissociation, so that the middle of the room, which would be the point of connection, often felt like a big cave. Everybody just sort of fell into this dissociative process. And I've done groups with women who were sexually assaulted, where there was a date rape drug involved. And so therefore there is no avenue to be able to pursue that criminal court system, because you can't remember what happened to you. So all of these group experiences carried on. All of the individual work carried on. It got easier as I got more skills involved and had more experience, could recognize things faster. I brought all of that experience to the teaching that I do, and we can talk about that in a moment. And then the other part that got very interesting to me was that I would notice that people would be doing better as individuals, but not so well in terms of those who were in relationship. How was it transferring over to their relationships? And of course, when I get curious, I embark on a process. And so long story short, I have done a great deal of training in couples modalities, but I keep using my frame of Imago Relationship therapy. And so now all of my couples, pretty much all of them, one or both of the partners are also trauma survivors. And at the time when I first started to do that training around couples work, I kind of thought, well, this might be a little bit of a break from trauma work. Maybe, a little communication problems, a little adultery, maybe something like that. Of course, it is way more complicated than that. And in my case, my reputation around being a trauma therapist also led the way that all of the couples are also one or both are trauma survivors. So at that point I said, all right, I accept that this is my niche. I will continue to work in this, but I need to be more mindful then about vicarious traumatization and how it's working on me and how I can work to mitigate that, which is something that I think we need to talk more about when for new trauma therapists who are coming into the field, to understand that it has nothing to do with their competency. Nothing.
All right, let's pause there, because you're hitting a lot of topics that I do want to talk about, but I really want to talk about this one thing, Maureen, and I want to kind of take a little deep dive here. You talked about all these groups you ran, which seem fascinating. You started out doing private practice, but I want to ask you about your own process of again, sitting with people who've been impacted by trauma. What was that like for you? How did you manage that? How did you deal with that? And how did you discover the importance of doing your own work in a sense while working with this population?
Sure. Because it is kind of essential that we take care of ourselves in the work in that sense. So I did a number of things. Um, uh, I'm part of a regular peer consultation group that's been meeting for years. So it is a very important place for me to be able to go and to talk about what the work brings up for me. I do believe very strongly that the work will bring up lots of stuff
Right.
with us, and we need to have a place to talk about it. I know, for example, that I tend to be, if we frame it up as somebody who might work overtime with a client and be a rescuer, or somebody who might tend to be a little bit avoidant, I tend to be more on the avoidant side than on the rescuing side.
Mm-hmm.
And I have had to learn what are those signs inside of me that I am kind of disconnecting a little bit, pulling back my energy a bit in some kind of way because I am being overwhelmed in some kind of
So what are those signs?
um, so my internal dialogue changes. I will start to feel more critical about the client as opposed to maintaining that curiosity and maintaining the compassion with that. Um, and I will look at the clock, will be one of the clues, right? Like, and their internal dialogue is how much longer is this going to be for
Mm-hmm.
this session? Um, and there is this kind of, because of all the somatic work that I've done, there is this kind of tightening that happens sort of in my chest here that I recognize as the place where I'm sort of pulling in as a way to pull back. So I've gotten pretty good now at recognizing those signals
Mm-hmm.
and doing something to help reground myself in that moment. Often I'll ask my client to do it with me. Let's just
Mm-hmm.
take a moment and breathe
And
together.
does that happen because, for example, you might be triggered or you might be bored, like many therapists, but it's interesting because oftentimes we hear, you know, trauma therapists, maybe therapists in general, but trauma therapists specifically, getting into the field because they want to help, they want to save, they want to rescue, right? Um, but not a lot of times we hear what you're talking about is kind of the opposite. The word you use, kind of avoidant. When does that come up?
Well, let's see. I grew up in a family situation where there was far too much intrusive behaviors. And because of those intrusive behaviors, my adaptation was to learn to pull in, kind of like a turtle, pull in like underneath the shell. And so I often think of myself as a turtle in recovery. And so it is this push pull inside of me, the curiosity about people. And for sure, there's a part of me that wants to help. I think that uh, that is both our strength and our Achilles heel as therapists in this field. But for me, it is the place of wanting to help and a place of having to grow my container over the years for it to be bigger and stronger to be able to hold all of which um, I need to hold, right, and be able to receive it all.
I appreciate you sharing that. Um, so you talked a little bit about, what you're doing now,
Yep.
your students.
Yeah.
We talked a little bit about the challenges for getting into this field, but let's kind of approach that. What are you doing now, present
Okay.
day?
In terms of my teaching, I the program that I'm teaching in at the JI is something called Postgraduate Certificate in Complex Trauma. And it involves a online semester that is really about the theory and it's very up-to-date program. So we're really talking about the up-to-dates, and then 3 face-to-face courses. And the first face-to-face course is about stage one, essentially, if we follow the 3-stage kind of model, assessment and safety and resources. Then we do a component that's all about somatic responses. And then we do a third face-to-face course that is about the two things. One is about working with, memories and the toxic kernels that need to be processed, as well as really exploring ourselves in the work.
Mm.
So that's the program in a kind of a nutshell. And part of why we wanted to do it is that, to my regret, in my opinion, I think that our field is making a bit of a mistake in that we are boutiquing everything. We're turning everything into a model that you must then get certified in that model, as opposed to training therapists to be just really good at some of the key skills that need to happen. So I, for example, think that it is important for trauma therapists to know how to do ego state work, period. But whether you do that through EMDR or IFS or any of those other Janina Fisher's work, whatever they all rest on the same fundamental principle that you know how to do ego state work. And so that's what this program is really committed to doing, is to really providing this kind of foundational sense of what the skills are to do the work. And then if they want to go on and do this, the specialized training in sensorimotor or whatever it might be, then by all means they could do that. But they're funneling that information then into this foundation, which I think makes for, at least this is my hope, makes for better all around trauma therapists.
So this is through the Justice Resource Institute.
The Justice Institute.
Justice Institute.
Yes.
And who's eligible can take this course?
Any therapist who has a master's level degree is welcome to apply for it.
Okay, and it's online?
The first one is online. The first online is online. That didn't say that well. The first course is online.
Okay.
And then the other 3 are face-to-face.
Okay. It's interesting the way you described that in terms of boutiquing, because I agree with what you're saying, and it's very interesting, and I agree that it also presents newer therapists and probably all therapists with a sense of overwhelm. But what you're talking about here, if I'm hearing you correctly, is providing a kind of really good foundation for trauma therapists in general.
Yeah. What do I need to know? One of the advantages of me being the work as long as I've been doing it is that I got to learn things as we were all learning them. So I got to learn about dissociation as we were all beginning to understand that, for example, right? But now, if you are entering the field as a trauma therapist, it's overwhelming. It's like you got to understand dissociation, and you got to understand polyvagal theory, and you've got to understand somatic approaches, and you've got to, don't forget your right brain ones like art therapy. And, that is so much. Right? And I think that my fear is that we lose some people who might be very, very good additions as colleagues, but in the overwhelm, it's just too much, because to get from there to a place where you're comfortable, you've got to go through a pretty tough journey of feeling pretty incompetent. And there's always going to be something to learn, as opposed to what I say to my students, at least, is I am a firm believer in lifelong learning. And that it really, in fact, my experience has been that it helps with keeping us fresh, helps mitigate vicarious traumatization in that kind of way. So if we could have a foundation and then, plan to spend the next, 30 years of our career continuing to learn in different kinds of ways, folding it into this foundation, boy, we'd have very rich colleagues, I think.
So you mentioned the importance of ego state work.
Yeah.
Can you talk about maybe a couple of other pillars that are integral to providing this foundation of foundational work you're talking about?
So I think the other thing really is to really understand the neuroscience. That's very important. And it is, as you know, I'm sure, guys, so rapidly changing. You speak about it often in your posts and in your therapist newsletter. So to really keep current with that, if we do follow that, then that's going to quite naturally lead us into having an understanding about polyvagal theory, and how helpful that has been for me to be able to recognize the signs that a client of mine might be in one of those different states. Dissociation is essential and has been very undervalued or overlooked. If you talk to most people, they'll be able to tell you about fight flight responses, but not that many will be able to tell you about the low freeze and the collapse kinds of responses, which happen for more people in terms of interpersonal violence than fight flight does. And so for those folks, if we're not educated and informed about this, then we're not going to be able to provide the necessary support for them. And then when I think that we do need to really understand bottom up approaches in a much more deeper way, and have that be more integrated not only in ourselves, but also to bring that into the work with our clients, and to understand that many trauma survivors, because they've adapted by kind of from the numbing from the neck on down, that might be a very slow process to be able to restore that kind of introception, being able to notice your own self and your own body. But that's an essential piece of the work. But if we're just sort of tossing it in a little bit, then we'll quickly leave it because it's much slower work. And yet it is essential, I believe, to be able to have a good life, to be able to have your body not hijack you.
I really appreciate what you're talking about here. We've on this podcast, I don't think anyone's really articulated the problem, if you want to call it that, of becoming a trauma therapist in a sense. But I love the way you were kind of presenting a kind of solution, if I may, because I think you're right on the money. When you're teaching in this course and people say to you, well, what about EMDR, and what about Sensorimotor, and what about somatic experiencing, and what about IFS? Do I need to learn that? Do I need to know that? Do I need to get certified in that? What is your response?
I say, I encourage you to take what you're learning in this course and sit with it for a little bit and allow it to integrate. And then whichever of those other modalities interests you that you want to pursue, go for it. I will say that I think that most trauma therapists need to have EMDR. And there's so many variations of it, as you know. But I think that's a pretty essential skill for a trauma therapist to have. And to think about it as a lifelong process, as opposed to I must do X and Y and Z, and then I will be good enough to do the work.
All right, let me ask you something here. You touched a little bit on it, but I want to see if we can get a clearer picture, and that is an early clinical error and what you learned from it.
Yeah. I think that I am going to just join the chorus of other people that you've had on the podcast who have said that I went too fast. Just really not appreciating that a client has very, very good reasons for having to compartmentalize what they have done. And that nobody can give up those defenses until we've really, provided them some alternative resources to manage themselves, and that those defenses really need to be respected as opposed to breached. And once I finally kind of got that, Surprise, surprise, the number of crisis calls went down, the number of visits to the ER went down. All of that went down once I really took in that I think it's Richard Clough who said that we're going to get there the fastest by going slowest. And so that I would say would be the biggest clinical error I made, yes.
I really like the way you described that, and said that defenses need to be respected rather than breached. It immediately brought to my mind that carnival game where, those things pop up and you're like trying to nail it. Oh, I got it. But what do you see in terms of, students who are taking your course? How are they, and I guess it's hard to generalize, but how are new students coming to you? What are they expecting? What are they, what are their fears in a sense? What are their curiosities about this topic?
So I think this represents a bit of the good news, Guy, in that trauma is becoming a bit more of a mainstream topic. And so that generally speaking, I think we have an increase of clients coming, seeking counseling to work on their trauma issues. Mm-hmm. And so therefore the clients are driving the demand, so to speak. They want trauma-informed people. So then the question is, if I was new, it would be like, okay, where do I go to get that information? And so for our students who find their way into our program, I think what really attracts them to it is that we're going to give them a big picture and we're going to give them the foundation. The fear is two categories. So one would be, not competent. I'm never going to be good enough. Often they'll say something to me like, well, I wonder if I'm ever going to be as good enough, as good as you are. And I'm going to say, well, I should hope that after 30 years of me doing this, I have become good enough. Otherwise, there's something seriously wrong here. But related to that is the fear of doing harm. That is such a big fear. And it is important for us, I think, to convey to new therapists coming in that our clients are both and. They are both fragile and vulnerable, and they have been terribly injured. And they are strong and resourceful and resilient because they're still here and they are actively seeking our help. And we got to pay attention to that as well.
Awesome.
So when I ask people then to think about their first meetings with a new client, I would say to them, ask the client what works for them. Ask them about their strengths and their resiliencies. Ask what works in terms of resources. And then just at the beginning, only ask for the Twitter version of what their trauma history is. And, begin that way so that you can slowly, carefully sidle up to the trauma that needs to be done.
Awesome. Well, I am excited about getting word out about this course. I'll include that on the show notes page. I'll also include it in the newsletter,
right,
if I can do that. So as we kind of wind down here, Maureen, how about a go-to book recommendation from you? Whether trauma related or not, what do you got?
Okay, well, the couple books that I'm reading right now is It Didn't Begin With You, which is about intergenerational trauma, and My Grandmother's Hand, which invites us all to look from a Jedi perspective. The real classic books I think that people need to read are The Body Keeps the Score and The Haunted Self.
Haunted Self, okay. Who did The Haunted Self?
That is Kathy Steele, Anno Van Hart and Company.
Okay.
Ellert Einhaus. And one more that I would give, which would be Janina Fisher's Healing the Fragmented Self, just because it's a nice blend of somatic and ego state work.
Awesome. Okay. Awesome books, a classic lineup, which again, I'll have listed at the show notes page at the traumatherapistpodcast.com. Maureen, awesome. Refreshing, to have you on here, to hear you talk. And I really appreciate you sharing your own experience, because I think that's what really makes this podcast sing, if I can use that term. But again, really, I really appreciate you coming on here, and I'd love to have you back at a later time, and we can talk about other things from your extensive experience. It's an honor to have you on here. I want to thank you so much.
Thank you, guys. Been my pleasure.
All right. Take care.
All right then.